At my granddaughter's school recital, my son-in-law's father grabbed Sophie by the wrist and yanked her off the stage because she'd embarrassed him in front of his business partner. My son-in-law stood 6 feet away and looked at his watch. My daughter started to cry silently, the way people cry when they've learned that crying out loud only makes things worse. I set down my program, folded it neatly, and excused myself to get some air. They had no idea who I was. They never had. Before I get to what happened next, I need to go back to the beginning. Not all the way back, but far enough that you understand what I walked into that evening and why what followed was, in my estimation, entirely proportionate. My daughter called me in late January, not to chat, just to tell me Sophie's spring recital was the first Saturday of May. She gave me the date the way someone reads off a grocery list, flat, efficient, nothing extra. I asked if everything was all right. She said yes. I asked how Sophie was doing. She said fine. I asked how she was doing. There was a pause just long enough to notice. Fine, Daddy. We're all fine. I'd been hearing that particular version of fine for almost 3 years. I drove up from my house in Crossville to Nashville that Friday evening. The kind of late April drive where the dogwoods are still holding on and the air smells like something new is about to happen. I was staying at a motel on the west side of the city. Nothing fancy. The kind of place that gives you a parking spot right outside your door and leaves you alone. My daughter had offered their guest room. I'd declined. I'd learned over the past few years that staying under that roof, even for one night, changed the dynamics in ways that weren't good for anyone. I'd met my son-in-law 4 years ago, 6 months before the wedding. He was handsome in the way of people who know it, confident in the way of people who've never had a reason not to be. He worked for his father's commercial real estate development company, a Nashville firm called Harmon Group, which had its name on 3 buildings downtown, and its logo on enough sponsored events that it was hard to avoid. He was polite to me at dinner that first time, attentive, asked questions about my work. I told him I was retired. He asked from what? I said federal government, administrative work. He nodded and moved on, which told me something about him right there. He was only interested in answers that might be useful. His father, my son-in-law's father, I met for the first time at the rehearsal dinner. Richard Harmon was 67, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who takes up more physical space than his body requires. He had the handshake of someone who learned somewhere that grip equals dominance, and the laugh of someone who expects the room to join in. He told 3 stories that night, all of which ended with him making more money than someone who deserved it less. My daughter sat at the far end of the table and smiled at the right moments and refilled everyone's water glasses without being asked. I watched all of this and said nothing. I had 31 years of watching rooms, and this room told me everything I needed to know. The wedding was beautiful. My daughter looked the way brides look in the best moments lit from somewhere inside. Sophie was born 14 months later, and for a little while after that, when I visited or when they drove down to see me, things seemed manageable. Sophie was an extraordinary child from the start. Curious, determined, the kind of kid who asks 4 follow-up questions to every answer you give her. She loved science, bugs, weather patterns, the phases of the moon. She'd call me on Sunday afternoons and tell me what she'd been reading about. Dinosaur migration, black holes, why thunder follows lightning. I'd listen for as long as she wanted to talk. Over those 3 years, though, I watched my daughter change in increments small enough that maybe only a father would notice. She stopped calling for no reason. When she did call, she was always somewhere particular. The grocery store, Sophie's school pickup line, somewhere she could legitimately cut it short. The easy laugh I remembered from when she was young, the one that came out of nowhere and didn't care who heard it. That laugh went quiet. When I visited, she apologized constantly. For the house, for the meal, for Sophie being too loud, for things that didn't require apology from anyone. My son-in-law's father had a way of entering every room and rearranging it. Not physically, just atmospherically. When Richard Harmon sat down at a table, decisions about where to eat and what to order and when to leave somehow became his. My son-in-law deferred to him completely, not out of love but out of habit, the way people defer to weather. And my daughter had learned to defer to my son-in-law, which meant that somewhere in the chain, She had stopped existing as someone with preferences. I watched all of this. I said very little. I had reasons for that, which I'll get to. The Saturday of the recital arrived gray and warm, the kind of spring day that can't decide what it wants. Sophie's school, a small private academy in Belle Meade, had set up a combined science fair and performance evening in their gymnasium. Children had built displays along the perimeter of the room: volcanoes, solar systems, water filtration models, and in the center, a small stage had been assembled for musical performances and the school's fifth-grade presentation on environmental science. Sophie's display was in the back corner. She'd spent 6 weeks building a model of a weather station, real instruments, a working anemometer she'd constructed from foam cups and pencils, a barometer she'd calibrated herself. She'd written a 12-page report on local climate patterns that her teacher had described in a note sent home as remarkable for her age. I arrived early and found her immediately, standing at her display table in a blue dress, explaining something to another child with her hands moving the way mine move when I'm engaged in something I care about. When she saw me, her face did what Sophie's face always did when she saw me. It opened up completely. No filter. Just joy. "Grandpa." She ran to me, and I caught her and held on for a moment. She smelled like the grape lip balm she'd been obsessed with since winter. I set her down and she pulled me by the hand to her display and told me everything. The instruments, the data she'd collected, the graph she'd made of wind speed measurements over 30 consecutive days. My daughter arrived 20 minutes later with my son-in-law. She hugged me carefully, like someone hugging around a sore place. She looked tired in the way of people who've been tired long enough that they don't mention it anymore. My son-in-law shook my hand and said, "Good to see you," and looked at his phone. Richard Harmon arrived at 6:15, which was after the gymnasium had filled, and just before the stage presentations began, the entrance of someone who has decided that being on time is for people with less going on. He brought a woman I hadn't met before, younger than his son, introduced as a colleague from a development project they were pursuing in Franklin. Her name was Diane. She had the polished, alert energy of someone at a business dinner who is simultaneously enjoying herself and collecting information. Richard moved through the gymnasium the way he moved through every space, like a man inspecting a property he was considering purchasing. He examined Sophie's display for approximately 45 seconds. "Weather," he said. "Practical." Then he looked at Diane and said something about one of their projects in a county 3 hours away that had required meteorological permits and how ridiculous the whole process had been. Sophie stood beside her display and waited for him to finish. "Nice job, kiddo," Richard said to her, already half-turned toward something else. I watched my daughter watch this. She smiled the smile of someone who has learned that expecting more leads to disappointment. The stage presentations began. Sophie's class performed second, a 15-minute piece on watershed conservation that the children had written themselves. Sophie had a speaking part, 2 full paragraphs she'd memorized about rainfall patterns and agricultural runoff. She delivered them clearly, without the usual fidgeting of 8-year-olds in front of audiences. She was precise. She was confident. She was absolutely her mother's daughter from before. When her section ended, Sophie looked into the audience. She found me first. I gave her a thumbs up. She found my daughter, who was already wiping her eyes quietly. Then she found my son-in-law's father, sitting 2 rows up with Diane, and she gave a small wave. Richard Harmon, apparently in the middle of saying something to Diane, missed it entirely. He was describing, from what I could gather, a zoning dispute that had gone in his favor. Sophie finished the performance and came off the stage and went directly to my daughter. She hugged her mother around the waist, and my daughter bent down and whispered something in her ear, and for just a moment the two of them were in their own world, complete. Then my son-in-law's father came forward. He told Sophie she'd done well, then immediately pivoted to telling Diane that public speaking was a skill most people never developed properly, and that he'd made his son take speech courses at 14. He talked for several minutes about his son's accomplishments, standing directly in front of Sophie's display as he did so, effectively blocking her from view. Sophie stood to the side, holding her program with both hands, listening politely. Diane, to her credit, eventually said something about Sophie's weather station, how detailed it was, How impressive for a child her age. Sophie's face lit up. She started explaining the anemometer construction, how she'd had to recalibrate it twice because the first measurements were skewed by the position of the school building's corner and the way it channeled wind. Richard Harmon's expression shifted in a way I recognized immediately. Not anger yet, just the early movement toward it. The slight tightening around the eyes of someone who is used to being the most interesting thing in any room and has just noticed that something else has captured an audience he considered his. "That's enough on the wind thing," he said. His voice was easy, almost amused. "I think Diane gets the idea." Sophie glanced at my daughter, then back at Richard. "But I haven't explained the barometer yet. It took me 3. Richard Harmon put his hand on Sophie's shoulder. He squeezed once, a silencing gesture. "Sophie, enough. You're monopolizing the conversation. What's the first rule your father's been teaching you?" Sophie said nothing. She looked at the floor. "What's the rule?" "That I should listen more than I talk," Sophie said, very quietly. "That's right." He patted her shoulder once, removed his hand. "Now let the adults visit." I was watching my daughter during this. She had gone very still. The stillness of someone who has learned that any movement in the wrong direction makes things worse. My son-in-law was looking at his phone. Sophie moved to stand beside me. I put my arm around her shoulders. She leaned into me without saying anything, which was very unlike her. The evening continued. There was a reception afterward, coffee and small cookies on folding tables. Richard and Diane fell into conversation with another parent, who apparently knew one of Richard's business associates, and the conversation turned entirely to commercial real estate in 3 counties east of Nashville, the kind of conversation that expands to fill whatever space is available. Sophie drifted back to her display table. A few other parents stopped by, asked questions, and she answered with her usual precision, though quieter now. I watched her measure each answer before giving it, checking the room first. That was new. That carefulness was new. Around 7:30, Sophie's teacher came by and told her the displays would be photographed for the school newsletter, and asked if Sophie could stand beside her weather station for a photo. Sophie agreed, her brightness returning somewhat, and she repositioned her instruments and straightened her display cards with the seriousness of a scientist reviewing equipment before a test. Diane came over to watch, genuinely interested, asking Sophie a question about the barometric readings, and Sophie was in the middle of a very good explanation, the kind of spontaneous, unguarded explanation she gave to me on Sunday phone calls when Richard Harmon appeared at her shoulder. He said something to Diane about the car, that they needed to head out shortly. He had an early morning. And then he looked at Sophie and said, "Time to wrap it up." But Grandpa Harmon, the photographer, hasn't come yet, and he reached out and gripped her wrist and pulled her, not violently but firmly, the way someone moves an obstacle. "Come on, we're not waiting for pictures," he said. "Some of us have real work tomorrow." Sophie stumbled forward a step. Her display card fell. The foam cup anemometer tilted, and one of the cups cracked against the edge of the table. Sophie looked at it. Her eyes went bright with tears she was too proud to release in public. My son-in-law, who had been 6 feet away, looked up from his phone, assessed the situation in approximately 1 second, and looked back down. His mother's event, his father's call, that was the calculation. I could see it. My daughter stepped forward. She started to say something, but my son-in-law put his hand briefly on her arm, and she stopped. I looked at my granddaughter. Her chin was up. She was holding it together with the focused effort of someone who has learned, too young, how to hold it together. I said, "Excuse me for a moment." My voice came out steady, which it almost always does when I need it to. I picked up the fallen display card and set it back carefully. I looked at Sophie and said, "Don't touch the anemometer. I'll fix it before we leave." Then, I walked toward the exit. Outside, the parking lot was half empty, the spring evening gone properly dark. I stood in the far corner near my car and took my phone out of my jacket pocket. 31 years with the FBI does a number of things to a person. It teaches you patience that most people find unsettling. It teaches you to document, always, instinctively, the way other people reach for their phones to check messages. It teaches you that the most useful power is the kind that doesn't announce itself, and it gives you, over 3 decades, a network of people who take your calls at 7:30 on a Saturday night. I dialed a number I knew from memory. My former partner, who had retired 2 years after me and now ran a consulting practice that worked with federal agencies on financial investigation cases, answered on the 3rd ring. He said my name like a question. I told him where I was and why, briefly. Then I told him what I knew about Harmon Group. Not speculation. Facts. Things I had assembled carefully over 2 years of watching and listening and cross-referencing public records the way I'd been trained to do. I told him about the rezoning approvals on 3 separate projects that had moved through county planning offices with unusual speed. I told him about a subcontracting arrangement that appeared in public documents, but whose payment records, when I'd requested them through a public records filing, showed figures that didn't line up. I told him about a conversation I'd overheard between Richard Harmon and my son-in-law 18 months ago at Thanksgiving, parts of which I'd written down afterward from memory because that was habit. Because 31 years doesn't just stop. My former partner was quiet while I spoke. When I finished, he said, "You've been sitting on this." "I was waiting," I said. "There's a difference." He said he'd make some calls. I went back inside. Sophie was standing at her display table with her teacher, who had found the photographer after all. When Sophie saw me coming, she watched my face. I gave her a small nod. She seemed to read something in it, though I couldn't have said exactly what. I repaired the anemometer with a piece of tape from the supply table near the coffee station. Sophie posed for her photo. She stood straight, one hand resting on her barometer, the other at her side, and she looked directly into the camera with the composure of someone twice her age. Richard Harmon and Diane left without ceremony. On the drive home that night, I thought about the question I'd been asking myself for 2 years. My daughter didn't know what I'd done before retirement. Not specifically. She knew I'd worked for the federal government. She knew it had involved law enforcement in some capacity. She knew it was something I didn't discuss in detail. Partly because I'd signed things, partly because it was simply a habit of mind I'd never fully shed, and partly because I'd chosen, after 31 years of being Special Agent Frank Calloway, to spend my remaining years being her father. Just her father. Not an asset, not a resource, not a former badge carried around to impress or intimidate. I'd watched Richard Harmon dismiss me at the wedding rehearsal dinner, at every Thanksgiving, at every interaction across 4 years, because I was a retired federal employee living in a small house in Crossville who drove a 12-year-old truck and didn't play golf. I'd let him. I'd watched him absorb my daughter into his orbit and teach my son-in-law to do the same. And I'd watched my granddaughter learn to make herself smaller in rooms where Richard Harmon was present. I'd waited. I'd documented. I'd thought about proportionate response, the way I'd been trained to think about it. That Saturday in May, watching Sophie hold her chin up while a man who should have celebrated her instead dragged her by the wrist away from the best thing she'd built all year, I decided I had waited long enough. 3 days later, my former partner called back. "There's interest," he said. "More than casual. The rezoning pattern you described matches a methodology that's come up in 2 other jurisdictions in the last 4 years. They've been building towards something. What you have may be the connective tissue." He put me in contact with a special agent in the Nashville field office. A woman, thorough, about 40, who came to Crossville the following Thursday and sat at my kitchen table for 2.5 hours. I gave her everything I had. Documents, dates, the conversation I'd transcribed from memory, public records, and what they suggested when read alongside each other. She listened the way good investigators listen, mostly quiet, occasionally redirecting, never suggesting what answer she was hoping for. Before she left, she looked around my kitchen. The degrees on the wall that I hadn't bothered to take down: a criminology degree from the University of Tennessee, a master's from Georgetown, a commendation plaque from a case in 2009 that had been in 3 newspapers and that I had moved to the hallway because I got tired of looking at it. She read them without comment. "You're Frank Calloway," she said. "The Frank Calloway. The Mercer trafficking case." I told her that was a long time ago. She nodded once. Then she drove back to Nashville, and I went and sat on my back porch, and listened to the birds for a while. My daughter called that evening. She sounded smaller than usual, which was hard to calibrate because small had become her baseline. I asked if she was all right. She said, of course. I said her name. Not anything else. Just her name. The way I'd said it when she was young, and I could tell something was wrong before she could figure out how to say it herself. She was quiet for almost a full minute. He told me I embarrassed him, she said finally. At the recital. Because I almost said something when his father grabbed Sophie. He said, I have no sense of appropriate timing, that I always want to make things bigger than they need to be. I listened, she said. Maybe he's right. I said, he's not right. She said, Daddy, you don't know everything that. I said, I know you. I know who you were before, and I know what I'm watching now, and they are not the same. She didn't say anything. I said, you don't have to do anything right now. I just need you to know that when you're ready to move, I am standing right here. She said, okay. She said she had to go start dinner. She said she loved me. 6 weeks later, the Nashville field office executed search warrants on the offices of Harmon Group. The affidavit, which I only learned about through my former partner, who had been looped in as a consulting resource, laid out a pattern of bribery involving 3 county planning officials across 2 development projects totaling roughly $14 million. There were also questions about subcontracting funds that appeared to have been diverted, the precise irregularity I'd identified from the public records. I was at home when it happened. I watched the evening news and saw the exterior shot of the Harmon Group offices and the brief segment that followed. Richard Harmon had declined to comment. His attorney had issued a statement about cooperating fully with any inquiry, which is the statement attorneys issue when they haven't yet had time to decide what they actually want to say. My daughter called me 20 minutes later. Her voice was different. Still careful, still quiet, but something had shifted underneath it. The way the ground shifts after rain. She said, Dad, they're saying it's been going on for years. She said, Marcus, as she stopped. She started again. Marcus is on the phone with a lawyer right now and he's... She stopped again. I said I heard. She said, did you? Her voice did something complicated. She said, did you know about this? Did you do something? I told her the truth, which was that I had reported information I had observed and documented over time to the appropriate federal authorities, and that everything that was happening was the result of what those authorities had found when they investigated. She said, you reported them to the FBI. I said, yes. She said, how did you know who to call? How did you know? I said, sweetheart, I was with the FBI for 31 years. The silence was long, not uncomfortable, just long. She said, you worked for the FBI. I said, I was a special agent. I retired in 2019. I moved to Crossville and took up birdwatching, and I didn't tell you because I wanted to be your father, not your asset, not a tool, not the man with connections, just your father. Another long silence. She said, all the times Richard called you a small-timer, all the times Marcus said you didn't understand how the real world worked. I said, people tell you a great deal about themselves when they think you're powerless. She started crying, not the silent kind she'd been doing for years, the real kind, the kind that means something, has finally cracked open that needed to. She said, I need to leave him. I've needed to leave him for a long time and I didn't know how to start. I said, I'll be in Nashville tomorrow morning. She said, okay. I was there by 9. She met me at the door. Sophie was at school. The house was very quiet in the way that houses are quiet when something significant is ending. She took me through 3 years in 2 hours. Not the summary version she'd been giving me, but the full version, the one she'd been storing. The systematic undermining, the way my son-in-law had learned from his father to dismiss her contributions and then credit himself with the results. The way she'd learned to apologize preemptively. The way she'd begun to hear Richard Harmon's voice in her own head every time she was about to say or do something that came naturally to her. The way Sophie had started, just in the past year, to silence herself in certain rooms. I listened. I did not rush her, or redirect her, or offer solutions until she was finished. When she was finished, I told her I had a contact at a family law firm in Nashville that I had used before on a case, years ago. A woman who was thorough and precise and could move quickly when the situation called for it. I told her she would need to move before my son-in-law or his father could gather their resources, and that speed was going to matter. I told her that Richard Harmon's legal situation was going to occupy significant bandwidth for everyone involved in that family for the foreseeable future, which would limit their capacity to complicate her case. My daughter looked at me for a long moment. She said, "You've been thinking about this." I said I'd been thinking about this for 2 years. She said, "Why did you wait?" I said, "Because you weren't ready." I was, but you weren't. And this had to be your decision, not mine. Her eyes filled again. She shook her head slowly. She picked up the phone. The attorney filed for divorce the following week and petitioned for a temporary protective order based on a pattern of coercive control, supported by a detailed account my daughter had provided, and several pieces of documentation I had helped her identify and preserve over the preceding 2 years. Financial records, text messages, a log I'd encouraged her to keep quietly, which she had, for 14 months, without ever telling anyone she was doing it. My son-in-law's attorney attempted to characterize my daughter as unstable, citing her anxiety and weight loss as evidence of unfitness. My daughter's attorney countered with a behavioral health consultant who testified about the documented physiological effects of long-term coercive control. The narrative collapsed quickly. Richard Harmon, managing his own mounting legal difficulties, was in no position to provide the kind of financial and legal backstop my son-in-law had always relied on. The indictment came down in August. 2 counts of bribery of a public official, 1 count of wire fraud. The evidence was substantial. A pattern across multiple projects, multiple officials, meticulously documented. His attorney negotiated, but there wasn't much room to negotiate toward. The planning officials implicated cooperated with prosecutors. Harmon Group's assets were frozen during the investigation. The downtown buildings with the corporate name on them remained, but the name meant something different now. My son-in-law, in the chaos of his father's legal situation and his own dissolving marriage, made a series of decisions that his attorney later described, I was told, as suboptimal. He attempted to transfer certain marital assets without disclosure. My daughter's attorney discovered this through standard financial investigation and brought it before the court. The judge's response was not favorable to my son-in-law. The divorce was finalized in early October. My daughter and Sophie moved into a small rental house in East Nashville, in a neighborhood with a good elementary school and a coffee shop she could walk to, and a backyard where Sophie immediately began planning a garden. The settlement was fair, more than fair, once the hidden asset transfer had been accounted for. On the day they moved in, I drove up from Crossville with a truck bed full of things I'd been quietly accumulating. A good kitchen table, bookshelves, a telescope for Sophie's bedroom window better than the one at my house, with a proper mount and a star map application that could tell her exactly what she was looking at in real time. Sophie stood in the middle of her new bedroom and spun in a slow circle, taking inventory. She said, "Can I put my weather station by the window?" I said there was no better place for it. She helped me carry the shelves in. That evening, the 3 of us sat on the back porch as the light went out of the sky, eating pizza from a box because no one had thought to unpack the kitchen properly yet, and it didn't matter at all. Sophie had her star map application open on my daughter's phone and was identifying constellations with the focused authority of someone who has been studying this for some time. "Grandpa," she said, "did you know the light from some stars takes so long to reach us that the star might not even exist anymore by the time we see it?" I said I did know that. She said, "That's weird and amazing at the same time." I said most true things are. My daughter leaned her head back and looked up at the sky and breathed in a way I hadn't heard her breathe in years, easy, open, like someone who has just put down something very heavy. "Dad," she said. I looked at her. She said, "All those times you sat at their dinner table, all those times Richard talked about people like you, small houses, small lives, people who didn't understand how things worked. You never said a word." I said I heard everything I needed to. She shook her head slowly. She said, 31 years. Special agent. I said, It stopped being who I was when I retired. I didn't want to carry it into everything. I didn't want you to see me through that. I wanted to be your father. She said, "You were always just my father." I said, "I know." "That's why it worked." She laughed. A real laugh. The one I remembered. Sophie looked up from her phone to find the source of it and then started laughing too. The reflexive laughter of a child who loves the sound of her mother being happy, without needing to understand the reason. We sat outside until Sophie found Saturn. The criminal proceedings against Richard Harmon concluded the following spring. He was convicted on both bribery counts and the wire fraud charge. Sentencing was in March. I attended, sitting in the public gallery, the same way I'd sat in courtrooms for 31 years, watchful, quiet, taking in the room. His attorney argued for leniency, citing his community standing, his philanthropic record, the significant financial losses he'd already sustained. The prosecutor was young and thorough. He played recordings, presented financial records, walked the jury through a timeline assembled with the patience of people who take this work seriously. Richard Harmon sat at the defense table in a gray suit and listened to his own legacy being disassembled piece by piece. He received 3 years. Given the sentencing guidelines and his age and his attorney's efforts, it could have been more. I thought it was proportionate. Outside the courthouse, my former partner found me on the steps. He looked older than when we'd worked together, which meant I probably did too. He said, "You built a solid case. Gave them everything they needed to close it properly." I said the facts did the work. He said, "You always said that." I said it was always true. We shook hands and I drove back to Crossville. My son-in-law, separated from his father's resources and his father's reputation, had settled into a smaller version of his former life in a different part of the city. He complied with the court orders. He paid what he was required to pay. He requested his scheduled time with Sophie and, to his credit, showed up consistently. Sophie came home from those visits quieter than usual, but not unhappy. My daughter said she was watching carefully, and so far there was nothing to act on. Some people learn from consequence, and some people simply endure it. I wasn't certain yet which category my son-in-law occupied. Time would make that clear. One Sunday afternoon in April, Sophie called me from my daughter's phone, which was how she always called because her mother hadn't given her her own yet. "Grandpa Harold," I said. "This is he." She said, "I want to be a meteorologist when I grow up." I said, "What happened to marine biologist?" She said, "I can be both. They study ocean weather. It's called tropical meteorology." I said I didn't know that. She said, "Also I want to work for the National Weather Service because they fly planes into hurricanes to collect data." I said that sounded about right for her. She was quiet for a moment, the way she got when she was moving towards something. She said, "Grandpa, Mom told me you used to catch bad guys." I said I did, for a long time. She said, "Is that how you helped us?" I thought about how to answer that in a way that was honest and age-appropriate and didn't simplify things too much in either direction. I said, "I learned how things work a long time ago, and when your mom and you needed help, I used what I knew." She processed this. She said, "Like how I used what I knew about wind patterns to build the anemometer better the second time." I said, "Exactly like that." She said, "Okay." She said, "I have to go. We're making enchiladas." I said goodbye and sat with the phone in my hand for a while after she hung up. I thought about 31 years of work that had taken me into rooms most people never see, had asked me to understand motivations most people don't want to consider, had required me to sit patiently in positions of apparent powerlessness and wait for the moment when action was possible and proportionate and right. I thought about Richard Harmon at every dinner table, talking about value and substance and what it meant to be someone who mattered, and dismissing me each time with the comfortable confidence of a man who measures worth in a way that doesn't require him to look very hard. I thought about my daughter at that table, making herself small, apologizing for things that didn't require apology. I thought about Sophie at her display table, her chin up, the anemometer cracked, holding it together. The crayon drawing Sophie had given me at Christmas was on my refrigerator. 3 figures in a backyard under a large yellow sun. She'd labeled them carefully in her block letter printing. Grandpa, Mama, me. Under that, in slightly uneven letters, my family is the bravest. I wasn't sure I'd earned bravest. I'd been patient, and patient is different from brave. Brave is what my daughter had been when she picked up the phone and called the attorney. Brave is what she was. Every day she got up and rebuilt something that had been systematically dismantled for 3 years. Brave is what Sophie was when she stood in front of an audience at 8 years old and spoke clearly about rainfall patterns and didn't flinch. I just knew how to make a phone call. The spring evening was cooling off, and the birds in the tree line behind my yard were finishing their last announcements of the day. I had leftover soup on the stove that I should heat up. I had a book I'd been meaning to finish for 2 weeks. I had Sunday phone calls with Sophie to look forward to, and monthly drives up to Nashville for dinner that were starting, only recently, to feel like something other than reconnaissance. Mostly I had the particular satisfaction of a man who spent 31 years understanding that justice is not a single dramatic moment. It is patience, assembled into process. It is observation converted into documentation. It is knowing when to speak and what to say and who will listen. And it is understanding that the quiet grandfather in the small house with the 12-year-old truck is almost never who the room thinks he is. Richard Harmon was right about one thing. In the end, it pays to know how the real world works,